Well, the problem of how to fit in is a permanently insoluble problem. You know, we all sacrifice our pound of flesh to adopt a persona that makes us acceptable socially. There's huge benefit in that. You know, we wouldn't be able to talk if we didn't use the words that dead people uttered. We're the beneficiaries of socialization as well as the victims, and the victim element of that is permanent. There's no, and for some people it's much worse than for other people because it's harder for them to match their temperament to the social demand. But it's very seldom the case that radical social transformation is the answer to that problem, because those radical social transformations tend to go sideways in unexpected ways. I'm not a fan of currently promoted social justice theories of identity, and that's also partly why why people don't like me, or some people don't like me. And the theory of identity is basically predicated on the idea that your identity is your choice, and it's as mutable as your choice, and also that your choice is enforceable on others. And you might say, well, look, if I want to be treated a certain way, then why can't people treat me that way? Well, maybe they could, but how much force can you use? That's the real question. Should they be required to do it? Well, then you might say, well, perhaps if it was in your interest, they could be required to do it. But I don't think the identity theory that's at the bottom of all this is in anyone's interest, because it's actually inadequate. Identity is something practical. It's a game that you play with other people. You have to play it with other people. They have to cooperate. Otherwise, it's not playable. And so if you're going to be successful in the world, and we know this from the developmental literature in relationship to child development, when you're 2, you're egocentric and you tend to impose your game on the world. And that means you can't play with others. And 2-year-olds are notoriously non-social. They don't engage in mutual play. If you put two-year-olds side by side, they'll play, but they won't play with each other. Now, what Piaget, the developmental psychologist, great developmental psychologist, noticed was that around 3 or 4, children will start to negotiate the game. So a 2-year-old will just be playing with a truck back and forth, and maybe the other 2-year-old is playing with a doll, and they're side by side. But at 3, they have the doll or the truck, and then they decide whether they're going to play with the doll or the truck, and then they lay down the ground rules for the game, and then they both abide by them. And so they have a little identity within that game, but it's shared, and that means that they can cooperate and compete within that game. Well, that's the beginnings of identity. And so your identity is a mode of being and perceiving that opens the door for you in the social world. It isn't, only a tiny part of it is who you feel you are. Now, it's not like that's an unimportant part, but if you feel you're an unplayable game, that doesn't help other people play with you. And so part of the reason that law and all of the philosophy, let's say, behind it, ideology more accurately, has this egocentric view of identity, and it's never made explicit. And right, it's like we use the word identity, we won't even talk about what it means. Well, it means, and then we'll say, well, it means your felt sense of sexual identity, let's say, or gender identity, or however far that might be extended. Fair enough, but no, wrong. That isn't how identity works. It's way too sparse a theory to be playable. You know, and I insist on this playability because in a marriage isn't one interaction. A marriage is one interaction, then another one, then another one, then another one. And that pattern of interactions has to be played in a way that doesn't degenerate across time, right? And there's an ethic that governs that. And if the ethic produces a deteriorating game, then the relationship will end. So the game you're playing has to be repeatable. And it's out of that necessity for repetition that ethics emerges, actually. And your identity has to be a playable game. that means it isn't something you can merely enforce on other people. It doesn't work. And so the people who are hypothetically being helped by this are being encouraged to adopt a theory of identity, which is counterproductively egocentric. I just found a limit point for me. The limit point was, I'm not going to say words that ideologues want me to say. I don't care what the reason is. And I suppose part of the reason why it's justifiable to hate me, I suppose, is because that looks like it's uncompassionate. You know, what's the harm? And I was asked that a lot. Well, what's the harm in going, you know, these poor people are having great difficulty. Well, I'd have to believe that movement in this ideological direction was likely to help them, you know, before I would consider compassion appropriate grounds to go along with it. I don't believe that. I think the whole notion is so ill-conceived. I looked at all the background documents that were associated with the law, and all that did was further my conviction that there was something deeply wrong about what was happening. And even it wasn't going to help the people that it purported to help. I couldn't see any evidence for that. It's really hard to help people. You know, it's really easy to make things worse. And there was certainly nothing built into the law to assess whether this change was actually going to be beneficial. It was just the assumption, well, we know how to reconstruct things, so the world will be better. It's like, no, you don't. It's way easier to make things worse than better, especially when you're messing around with something as fundamental as gender identity, you know, which children usually have reasonably well established by the time they're 3. You mess with that at your peril, as far as I'm concerned. So, look, if you look at the way people's personalities are structured, you kind of have 2 exploratory dimensions. Openness, so that's creativity. Maybe that's exploration of the realm of ideas, and extroversion, and that's social landscape exploration. And then you have 3 dimensions that are more associated with stability. And those are negative emotion, that's neuroticism, agreeableness, that's compassion, and conscientiousness. And conscientiousness and agreeableness are both social virtues. And you might ask, well, why do you need 2 social virtues? Why isn't one enough? Compassion. Well, the answer is I think the answer is probably time frame. So conscientiousness, think of Margaret Thatcher. Conscientiousness is a cold virtue. It's like, why do I have to take this medicine? Because it's good for you. Will you force it down my throat? If necessary. Well, won't that hurt my feelings? Yes. But if you don't take it, you'll die. And that's a conversation in some sense that you have with sick children. You know, and compassion is for infants. Now, that doesn't mean that, and having said that, let me make no mistake about the fact that we're often reduced to the state of infants. So if you're extremely ill and you need to be taken care of, right? In some sense, you've been reduced to the state of an infant, and that compassion is necessary for you. But conscientiousness, it says, well, this is hard, but if you do it, it'll be better next week or next month, or you can make these sacrifices now and society will benefit as a consequence. You can forego this gratification, which is very frustrating, but the long-term consequences will be better. And so compassion isn't enough. And so if you bring in a conscientiousness virtue, which might be judgment, for example, or justice, which are both conscientiousness virtues, then it's easy to seem cold-hearted. And we were talking about squaring the circle. It's, well, we don't know how, because mercy and justice often conflict,
Right.
but they're both necessary principles. So why can't everybody just do what they want to all the time? Well, that's sort of an agreeableness question. That's a compassionate question. And the answer is, well, it doesn't work over the long run. It generates and deteriorates. I mean, I'll give you an example of the conflict. I remember one time my daughter got ill. She was about 3, and she got this mouth infection that was really quite brutal. She had a really hard time swallowing for about 2 weeks. It was very painful. And so we let some of our rules relax, like we let her come into bed with us, for example, and we let her be more dependent than we had previously. And no wonder, because she was suffering dreadfully. But there was a huge price to be paid for that when she got healthy again, because we had to go through the training again. And we learned then, well, that was an object lesson in the price to be paid for excess compassion. In the final analysis, it wasn't a helpful move. And the problem with agreeableness, with compassion too, is that it announces itself so self-evidently as a virtue that if you wave a flag and say, well, wait, here's the limit case for that, it's almost impossible for you not to be regarded as cold-blooded and harsh. And women are more agreeable than men, so they're more compassionate and more polite than men. The probability that that's associated with the necessity for them to be extremely patient with extremely dependent infants is very, very high. But that doesn't mean that it's the right principle to be used to govern your relationship with adults. And I can't help but see the spilling over of agreeableness into the campuses, for example, manifesting itself in claims like, well, this is a home. This is a place where people should be comfortable. This is a place where people should feel welcome and everyone should be included. And, well, fair enough, those are virtues, but it isn't obvious that they're the right virtues for a university. Or they're certainly, and even if they are, they're certainly an incomplete set of virtues. What about beauty and excellence? What about discrimination? The ability to make value judgments. That word itself has become a curse in some sense, to be discriminating. Well, that means you have judgment. You can tell the difference between what's good and what isn't. And that means you have to admit that some things aren't good.